I'm standing on my terrace right now, the light changing over the Guadalquivir River here in Seville, and for the first time in what feels like forever, I'm not waiting for anything to collapse. The ground under my feet feels solid. I built it carefully, honestly, without shortcuts or lies. And for the first time in 15 years, I'm not performing for anyone. I'm just here. And that's enough. But it wasn't always like this. For a long, long time, my life felt like a performance I was forced to be in, on a stage that was constantly shifting. The moment I really stopped loving Sarah, my ex-wife, was the second she screamed at me about napkins in front of 20 dinner guests. It wasn't the napkins themselves, not really. It was what I saw in her eyes when she did it. Absolute certainty that I deserved to be humiliated. That my very existence was something she had to manage, something to correct. 6 months later, I was signing divorce papers in a lawyer's conference room in downtown Charlotte. Each of us with our own attorney. Sarah was reapplying lipstick between pages like she was getting ready for a photo shoot instead of ending a marriage. 14 months after that, I was sitting in a cafe in Seville, watching the light dance over the river, and my phone lit up. It was a message from Ethan Carter, my old college buddy who still lived back in Charlotte and saw everything on Instagram. The message was short, but it hit me like a punch. Sarah's getting married in 3 weeks. Willamette Valley, some vineyard called Crimson Peak. I stared at that message for a long time because the timeline didn't make sense. Until it did. And then I remembered the business trips, the late meetings, the way she'd started dressing differently about 8 months before I filed. But here's the thing, I didn't feel angry. I felt something way more useful. I felt curious. Let me back up a bit, because none of this makes sense without the context of how we got there. Sarah and I met in Chicago 15 years ago, at some charity gala neither of us wanted to attend. She was in luxury real estate. I was in private equity. On paper, we looked perfect. For the first 3 years, we probably were perfect, or at least functional. Then we moved to Charlotte for my job. Bought a house in Myers Park that she immediately started renovating. And that's when I started noticing the pattern. Nothing I did was ever quite right. The furniture I picked was trying too hard. The restaurants I chose were obvious. My suggestions for spontaneous weekend trips got treated like I proposed setting money on fire. Now, I'm not saying I was innocent. I worked long hours. I got distant. I stopped trying to win arguments I knew I'd lose. But somewhere around year 8, I realized I'd started sleeping in my office twice a week just to avoid the feeling of walking into my own home. We had 2 kids, and they split exactly down the middle in a way that just broke my heart. Maya was 13 when I left, and she'd already figured out her mother's game. She'd watch Sarah critique everything from my shirt choices to how I loaded the dishwasher, and she'd roll her eyes in this tiny gesture of solidarity that made me want to protect her from the cynicism she was learning too young. Then there was Alex, who was 11 and completely Team Sarah, parroting everything she said about how I was cold and didn't care enough, and how I embarrassed her. I couldn't blame him. When you're 11 and your mom is magnetic and certain about everything, you believe her. Sarah had this way of rewriting history in real time. Telling people I forgot our anniversary when I'd actually planned a dinner she'd cancelled. Mentioning my anger issues at parties when I'd never raised my voice once in our entire marriage. The truth didn't matter. The story mattered. Have you ever lived with someone who controlled the narrative so completely that you started doubting your own memory? The napkin incident happened at a dinner party she'd insisted on hosting, even though I'd worked a 16-hour day and told her I desperately needed to sleep. She'd hired a catering team, rented specific glassware, created a seating chart like it was a state dinner. I was exhausted and trying to help. So, I set out the napkins, the expensive linen ones she'd bought from some boutique in Asheville. Apparently, I folded them wrong. She walked into the dining room, saw them, and her face did this thing it always did right before she decided to make an example of me. Her voice cut through every conversation in the room. 20 people stopped talking, and she performed her exasperation and disbelief like she was on stage, turning to her friend Chloe with this look that said, "Can you believe I have to deal with this?" I stood there, holding a napkin, and something in me just switched off. Not in an angry way, but in a final way. I looked at her and thought, I don't love you anymore. Just like that. Clean. Permanent. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just walked upstairs, took off my jacket, and started planning my exit. It took 6 months of quiet, deliberate preparation. I worked with a lawyer Sarah didn't know, a guy named Arthur Hayes who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and understood that revenge is a dish best served cold and legal. We moved money carefully, restructured assets, created a trust for the kids that she couldn't touch. The house, the cars, the furniture, I let her keep all of it. Sounds generous, right? Except Arthur had refinanced everything into her name 6 weeks before I filed, tied to loans with balloon payments she didn't understand and credit lines she'd maxed without realizing. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I was trying to escape without her destroying me first. The day I told her I wanted a divorce, she laughed. Actually laughed. Told me I wouldn't survive without her, like it was a fact. Like I was some kind of incomplete person who needed her to function. I didn't argue with that either. I just handed her the papers. The divorce was fast because I didn't fight her on anything visible. She got the house. I got my freedom. She told everyone I'd abandoned my family. I moved to Seville on an AD7 visa, found an apartment in Triana, and didn't correct the narrative. Maya texted me every day. Alex stopped speaking to me entirely. I saw a cardiologist in Seville who told me my blood pressure had dropped 30 points since leaving Charlotte, that I'd probably added 10 years to my life just by walking away. Sarah moved on faster than I expected. Within 4 months of the divorce being finalized, she was posting photos with Mark Thompson, some commercial developer who looked like he'd stepped out of a Brooks Brothers catalog. They were everywhere together, charity events, ski trips, restaurants with wine lists longer than most books. She looked happy in a way that felt aggressive, like she was proving something to an audience I was no longer part of. Looking back now, the red flags were everywhere. The speed. The performance. The way Mark's smile never quite reached his eyes. But Sarah had always preferred a good story to an inconvenient truth. Then Ethan Carter's message landed in my phone, and I found myself thinking about Crimson Peak Vineyard. I'd been there once years ago for a corporate retreat. The venue was famous for its architecture, some acoustic design feature where sound carried in weird ways. Conversations on one side of the terrace could be heard perfectly on the other, if you knew where to stand. I remember the event coordinator mentioning it, half joking about how couples should be careful what they whispered during ceremonies. I sat in that Seville cafe watching people live their small, real lives, and I thought about Sarah and Willamette Valley, performing happiness for 300 witnesses. I wasn't going to go to the wedding. That would have been pathetic. But I wanted it to be memorable. I wanted one person to stand up and say one true thing, just to see what would happen when the story she built met reality. So, I made a phone call to Daniel Evans, an old client who owed me a favor and knew how to move through wealthy circles without raising suspicion. I asked him to get himself added to the guest list. Sarah's wedding planner was someone who valued connections over verification, and I asked him to prepare a toast. Not cruel. Not obvious. Just honest enough to let the cracks show. Then, I sat back and waited. Because the thing about Sarah was that she'd built her whole life on a foundation that couldn't handle questions. And I was about to introduce questions she couldn't answer. Daniel called me 3 days after I sent him the details, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something's harder than expected. He'd gotten himself on the guest list by mentioning the Copper Ridge development deal. Apparently, Mark had been name-dropping that project for months to anyone who'd listen. Daniel figured he could position himself to give a toast by approaching the wedding coordinator during cocktail hour, offering to say a few words as a family friend from the Charlotte development community. Weddings that size always had people volunteering speeches, and coordinators rarely said no to someone who sounded legitimate. He asked if I was sure about this. Told me that once he said what I wanted him to say, there'd be no walking it back. I told him I wasn't asking him to lie, just to ask questions. And he said that was exactly what made it dangerous. Maya reached out 2 days later through Instagram, which was how we communicated now because Sarah monitored her regular messages. She sent me a photo from Sarah's feed, Mark and Sarah at some wine tasting in Sonoma, his hand on her waist, her smile so bright it looked like it hurt. Then Maya sent 3 words that made my stomach drop: he's a fraud. She told me she'd been doing research on Mark because something about him felt off. The way he talked about money. The way he never gave straight answers about his projects. She'd found legal forum posts from investors in Phoenix asking about Mark's development company, mentions of delayed payments and permits that never came through, and a pattern that looked like a shell game. She said a lawsuit was coming, maybe more than one, that she thought he'd been moving money around to stay ahead of it. When I asked how she knew all this, she told me she called one of the Phoenix investors, pretending to be a journalism student doing a project on real estate development. 14 years old and already better at investigation than most adults. I felt proud and terrified at the same time. Then she told me the part that made everything worse. Alex had moved in with Sarah and Mark full-time, convinced that I'd abandoned the family and that Mark was a real father figure. She said Alex worshipped Mark. Talked about him like he was some kind of hero. But she'd been watching Mark at dinner, and he didn't even look at Alex when he talked. Just performed for Sarah while Alex sat there like a prop in someone else's show. She told me she was coming to the wedding not to celebrate, but to document. She booked a flight using money she'd saved. Told Sarah she was staying with a friend that weekend. Planned to record everything in case something happened. I told her to be careful, that I didn't want her in the middle of whatever was about to happen. And she said it was too late, that this was her family, too. Alex called me 4 days before the wedding, and I barely recognized his voice. 12 years old, but trying to sound grown, cold in a way that sounded exactly like Sarah. He said his mom told him to call and let me know he wasn't interested in a relationship anymore, that I'd left and chosen myself over family, that Mark said a man doesn't run from responsibility. I let him finish, didn't interrupt, and then I asked him one question about Mark's last business partner and what happened there. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then he asked what I was talking about, and I told him I wasn't going to poison his mind with accusations, but I wanted him to do something for me at the wedding. Watch what people don't say. Watch who asks Mark about his work and how he answers. Watch his mom's face when someone congratulates her on the timeline. He told me I was pathetic, trying to ruin their happiness because I couldn't handle my own failure. Then he hung up. I sat there in my apartment in Seville looking at the river, thinking about all the ways you can lose a child without them dying. The rehearsal dinner happened on Friday night, and Maya sent me updates like she was filing reports from a war zone. Sarah was shaking, trying to hide it, but her hands kept moving. Mark told a story about acquiring a property in Phoenix, and 3 people at the table pulled out their phones right there. Alex gave a toast about new beginnings and how Mark showed him what strength looks like. Didn't mention me once. Daniel showed up and introduced himself as a family friend from the Charlotte development scene, and everyone bought it, though Mark looked nervous for about 2 seconds before recovering. Maya said the guy was good at performing. I told her to be careful, and she reminded me she was already in the middle of this, that it was her family too. The night before the wedding, Daniel sent me a voice memo. I listened to it on my terrace while the sun set over Triana, his voice steady and certain. He drafted the toast to sound like advice from an old friend. Stuff about foundations and making sure the structure can hold the weight, and transparency in partnerships. He'd mention me in passing, make it sound generous so no one would suspect, then pivot to questions, not accusations, just questions. How did Mark close 3 dealerships in 18 months when the market was down? Why did his credit lines get restructured right before the engagement? What happened to the investors in Copper Ridge now that the permits were delayed? He told me the thing about questions was that innocent people answer them easily, while guilty people get defensive. And Sarah was going to hear those questions in front of everyone she was trying to impress, and realize she didn't know the answers. I told him he could still back out, and he laughed. Said he'd sat through 100 weddings where everyone pretended everything was perfect while the foundation rotted underneath, that someone should tell the truth for once. Then he asked what I thought would happen after, and I told him honestly, I didn't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe Sarah would laugh it off and Mark would charm his way through and life would go on. Or maybe the questions would sit there like termites, eating away at the fantasy until the whole thing collapsed. Either way, I told him I wasn't there, and I wasn't part of it. I was just the guy who gave reality a microphone. Maya's last message came at 11 p.m. Willamette Valley time, 2 a.m. for me, asking if tomorrow was going to be chaos. I wrote back that tomorrow the truth gets to speak as loud as the performance, that after that, people can decide what they want to believe. Then I added that she should stay safe, record everything, and remember she was the smartest person in that room. She sent back a heart emoji, and I sat there in the dark, wondering if I'd just protected my kids or put them in the blast radius. The thing about truth is that it doesn't care about your intentions. It just detonates, and everyone nearby feels the shrapnel. The wedding was exactly what I expected. Perfect in that aggressive way Sarah always demanded, where every detail screamed money and taste and, look at what I built. Maya sent me photos throughout the morning, showing Crimson Peak Vineyard with rows of vines going golden in the September light. White chairs arranged in perfect curves, flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sarah in her dress, this fitted ivory thing that looked like it came from a Milan runway. Mark in a custom suit, his smile wide and confident, like a man who'd never been questioned about anything in his life. The guests arrived in their Range Rovers and Teslas, women in pastel dresses, and men in expensive casual wear that said, I'm rich enough to underdress. Everyone performed their roles perfectly, the emotional hugs, the champagne toast during cocktail hour. The way people kept saying, finally, and so happy for you, like Sarah had been waiting her whole life for this instead of divorcing 8 months ago. The ceremony was short and generic, some officiant talking about partnership and trust and building a life together. Words that sounded meaningful until you remembered Mark was facing investor lawsuits and Sarah had no idea. Alex stood next to Mark as a groomsman, chest out, trying to look like a man, and it broke something in me to see him there, believing in this. Maya sat in the back row with her phone positioned carefully, recording everything like she promised. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception terrace, this massive stone patio that overlooked the valley. And that's when I remembered what the event coordinator had told me years ago about the acoustics. How sound traveled in strange patterns. How the architecture created these invisible channels where voices carried across distances they shouldn't. Sarah and Mark did their first dance to some Ed Sheeran song, and people watched like it meant something. Like love was a performance you could purchase with the right venue and the right lighting. Dinner was served, some 5-course situation with wine pairings, and then the toast started. Sarah's business partner went first, talking about her drive and her vision and her ability to create beauty, which was true if you ignored everything it cost. Mark's brother spoke next, some generic speech about family and loyalty that sounded like he'd copied it from a wedding website. Then Alex stood up, and Maya's camera focused on him, his face serious and rehearsed. I listened through Maya's live audio feed from 7,000 miles away. Heard my 12-year-old son describe Mark as someone who doesn't run when things get hard, who shows up, who builds instead of destroys. He never said my name, but everyone knew who he meant. Sarah cried these delicate tears that didn't mess up her makeup, and Mark put his hand over his heart like he was genuinely moved. The audience applauded, and I watched my son sit down, believing he just honored something real. Then Daniel stood up, and the energy shifted in this subtle way that most people probably didn't notice. He introduced himself as an old friend from the Charlotte development community, mentioned some projects that made him sound legitimate, and started his toast with all the right words about foundations and partnerships and building something that lasts. People nodded along, comfortable, expecting the usual wedding platitudes. He mentioned me in passing, said something about how I was probably somewhere thinking of my kids today and wishing them well, his voice warm and generous. And I heard Sarah's breath catch on the audio feed. This tiny intake that said she hadn't expected grace. He talked about Mark stepping into not just a marriage, but a family, a legacy, a structure that needs solid ground. Then he shifted, so smoothly it felt like the same speech, started talking about foundations and what happens when you build on sand instead of stone. He asked Mark how he'd managed to close those 3 dealership acquisitions in Phoenix during the downturn. Said it was impressive timing, and the question hung there, friendly but pointed. Mark smiled and said something about market opportunity and strategic positioning. Words that didn't actually answer anything. Daniel nodded like he was satisfied, then asked about the Copper Ridge project and how the investors were handling the permit delays. Mark's smile tightened just a fraction, and he said they were working through normal regulatory processes, nothing to worry about. Daniel kept going, each question wrapped in admiration, asking about credit restructuring and timeline coincidences, and why Mark's business partner from the Phoenix deal wasn't at the wedding. The audience started shifting, phones coming out, people looking at each other with this slowly dawning realization that something was wrong. Sarah's face went from confused to angry to panicked in about 30 seconds. And then she stood up, her chair scraping loud against the stone, her voice carrying across the terrace. The acoustics did their job, bouncing her words back from 3 different directions, so it sounded like she was yelling from everywhere at once, demanding to know who. Daniel even was, saying this was inappropriate. This was her wedding. Daniel stayed calm, glass raised, told her he was just someone asking questions that good partners should be able to answer. Then he sat down, and the silence was enormous. Sarah walked off the terrace, heels clicking, and Mark followed her, his face red, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, phones out and typing, searching Mark's name, and finding exactly what Maya had found. Lawsuit filings, investor complaints, a Reddit thread from angry creditors. The wedding imploded in real time. Not with an explosion, but with this slow collapse where the foundation just gave out. Maya kept recording, caught Sarah in the hallway where she thought no one could hear, the acoustics delivering every word to the terrace. She was telling Mark he'd said this was handled, that the lawsuit was frivolous, and then she stopped mid-sentence, realized what was happening, pulled out her phone, and called me. I answered. Her voice was shaking, accusing me of sending Daniel, of ruining this. I told her the truth, which was that I hadn't ruined anything. I'd just let reality into a room she'd been keeping it out of. I told her life fell apart because she'd built it on a lie. Not my lie, but hers. She hung up. Within 6 hours, the toast video was on TikTok, then Twitter, then everywhere. Sarah's face as Daniel asked his questions, becoming a meme about denial and performance. Her real estate agency started getting calls, clients nervous about association, her reputation crumbling like Mark's business. The lawsuit against Mark went public 2 weeks later, fraud charges, asset seizure, bankruptcy. Sarah inherited his debts without meaning to, creditors coming after her because she'd co-signed loan documents before the wedding. Mark convincing her it was for their future together, and she'd trusted him the way she'd never trusted me. Alex called me 6 weeks after the wedding, and his voice was different. Smaller. Younger. Stripped of the performance. He apologized, said he didn't know, didn't want to know. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about therapy, about learning to set boundaries, about realizing his mother had taught him to value image over substance. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that's enough. Sarah lost the house, downsized to a condo in Gastonia. Her Instagram went quiet. I didn't celebrate any of it. I just kept living in Seville, walking to my favorite bookstore, having coffee at the same cafe every morning. That's where I met Elena. She owned the bookstore, loved poetry, laughed at things that were actually funny instead of socially strategic. We started talking, then having dinner. Then she met Maya when she visited for Christmas, and they stayed up until 2 a.m. talking about books and photography and what it meant to build a real life. Alex got engaged last month to a woman named Amelia who teaches elementary school and doesn't care about status or performance. He asked if they could have the wedding in Seville, something small and real, just family. The real victory wasn't the collapsed wedding. It was building a life based on truth instead of performance. This story shows that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to participate in someone else's lie and letting natural consequences do the rest. When you stop performing and start living honestly, even if it costs you everything, you've already won. What do you think about this story?